Welcome back to Women of Hollywoodland, the podcast that uncovers the feminist dawn of Hollywood. This is the very delayed episode number 7, where we will barely scratch the surface of the gloriousness that is Greta Garbo. I'm not even going to go into the shenanigans that resulted in this episode being delayed because I want to have a lie down in a darkened room at the very thought of it. But I have decided that for the time being, I'm just going to get an episode to you as often as I possibly can, rather than stressing about a specific schedule or seasons or anything like that. I hope that's okay. Also, I have just discovered that there are reviews in different stores on iTunes that I didn't even know about. So J Staub, C Chestnut and Mandy Pants, thanks a million. Now we're stepping outside the box a little bit with this episode because Garbo wasn't a filmmaker. She did take on a kind of executive producer type role on a couple of her projects, including Queen Christina, but she was primarily an actress. She was also working a little bit later than our primary period. When Mary Pickford and Lois Weber were launching their careers, Garbo was still at school in Stockholm, and in 1922, when many female filmmakers were losing their careers, she was working in the hat department of the pub department store. But even so, Garbo's power and influence over Hollywood during her career can hardly be overstated, so I think she's worthwhile taking a closer look at. That, and I kind of love her. In fact, I had to force myself to still double check books to pull out specific quotes and things like that for you for this episode because I pretty much know her life story off by heart by this point. And I feel as though she's one of these icons that just about everyone's heard of, but very few know anything much about her. I've even come across people who've heard the name but didn't even realize she was Swedish. Don't worry, I did shame those people. So, there are two particular aspects of Garbo's career that I want to highlight in this episode. One is just how famous she was. I was just racking my brains to try to think of somebody to compare her to, and I can only come up with musicians really, Elvis and the Beatles and Michael Jackson. Audrey Hepburn and Marilyn Monroe are the only two movie stars I can think of with even close to the level of iconic status of Garbo. And what's interesting about that is that all three are women. And I think that's important for us to take note of. In the past 20, 30 years, there's been all kinds of talk about how female stars can't helm movies, that they just don't draw audiences in the same way that guys do. And it has been used as justification for the fact that female stars are paid sometimes millions of dollars less than their male co-stars. Now, of course, there's always been actions and westerns that are arguably more male-orientated. But this idea of movies in general, certainly mainstream Hollywood movies, as inherently masculine in some way is very, very new. I don't know when exactly that idea was born, but I think maybe it was like the rise of the fanboys with Star Wars. Because the 80s seemed to be fairly dominated by quite blokey type franchises, Die Hard, Indiana Jones and Ghostbusters. And looking at the top 10 grossing films by decade, from the 80s onwards, every one of them is pretty male dominated. However, look in the other direction, and in the 70s you've got Grease and Love Story and Kramer versus Kramer, which, they're not female dominated, but they're certainly mixed. So from the 60s working backwards, the top grossing film of each decade was The Sound of Music, The Ten Commandments, Bambi, Gone with the Wind and Ben-Hur. And they're not chick flicks or guy movies, they're just movies, and they're great movies. I was kind of interested by this, so I just took a look at contemporary reviews for Queen Christina in 1933 and The Woman and Gone with the Wind, both released in 1939. Not one of them so much as mention the fact that these films are dominated by female leads in the way that today it's all stop the presses, this is a lady film. So it really seems to be that in the same way that pastel-coloured Lego for girls was invented sometime long after I was playing with Lego, the idea that given movies are for women or for men, and most often for men, it's very new and it's destructive. It leads to shit films. And honestly, that really is the point of this podcast. It's not just about celebrating that women got to make movies for the sake of it. It's pointing out that A, it is simply not true that Hollywood is inherently male dominated. I mean, as historical fact, it is wrong. And B, and more importantly, it's pointing out that when there's balance, there's better films. And I think that the main reason that some kind of balance, at least in terms of the stories being told at least, lasted long after the glory days of female filmmakers was that there were still so many powerful female stars around. As I said earlier, Greta Garbo was definitely number one, but even in her time, we also had Gloria Swanson and Norma Shearer and Joan Crawford. Aside from anything else, would you want to be the one to tell Bette Davis that she was the second lead? Now, of course, this isn't a perfect science. Grace Kelly, I would say, had that iconic status, but she invariably played the love interest. And of course, Marilyn Monroe's status came apart in a large part because she was a romantic fantasy. But that's another thing that makes Greta Garbo unique. She certainly had sex appeal, no question. She was one of the great vamps, if nothing else. But so often in movies, and frankly in life sometimes, it seems as though women can either have power or they can have sex appeal. Female characters invariably are either asexual ball breakers or the girly love interest. In fact, many of the more depressing rom-coms of the past couple of decades, often involving Sandra Bullock, it has to be said, actually have the woman's journey be from one to the other, because you can't be both. But Garbo was both. In fact, you really can't distinguish between her power and her sexuality. They are one and the same. She is mesmerizing because she is powerful, and vice versa. Now, the other aspect of Garbo's career that I want to talk about a little bit is her obsession with money, or more accurately, her determination to be paid what she was worth. She grew up in poverty. It always amuses me when bios refer to Södermalm as the slums of Stockholm, because I lived there for 5 years. These days, it's like Swedish celebrity hipster central, and you can't buy a shoebox apartment for less than a couple of million crowns. Incidentally, my first summer there, I rented an apartment just around the corner from where Garbo was born and grew up. I had just moved to Sweden and I didn't know a soul, so I spent a lot of my time reading, mostly Greta Garbo biographies, and I managed to stumble across the fact that when Garbo went off to the States and made her first lot of money, she bought her mother a new apartment in the building I was living in, like the exact same address. Even though it was only 6 or 7 blocks from their old apartment, and yes, I know precisely where it was. No, it's not stalking if the person's dead. It was, in those days, a step up in the world. Anyway, in 1937, Garbo wrote home to a friend, "I am incredibly tired of being a star, tired of the films they offer me, just tired in a word. But I'm not satisfied with what I've got in the way of money, so I'll have to keep working for a while longer." Bear in mind, this was just 5 years after she signed a contract that made her the highest paid woman in America. And even in her early years in Hollywood, she regularly went on strike for one reason or another. Louis B. Mayer fairly quickly discovered that he could count on being able to woo her back with the promise of more money. And I really respect that about her. There's this idea that, it extends to all creative industries, and it isn't limited to women by any means, though, as usual, women do suffer disproportionately, I think, that if you're a creative, you should love what you do so much that you should be happy to do it for free or be grateful to be paid at all. We've all heard the old joke about bands trying to pay their mortgage with exposure. And time again, when there's a discussion about how much less actresses are paid than their male co-stars, they very often say that they didn't negotiate as hard as they could have because they were just grateful to be cast. But not Garbo. So, a wee bit of background. Garbo was born Greta Lovisa Gustafsson on, according to Sven Broman's The Divine Garbo, one of the ugliest streets in the bleakest of working class neighbourhoods on the south side of Stockholm on September 18th, 1905. She was the youngest of three, and her father, Carl Gustafsson, suffered from some kind of kidney trouble, and so he worked fairly erratically with long periods of being too ill to work. Now, there's one story, I could have sworn that I read it in the Divine Garbo, but I can't find it now. But it's so brilliant, I'm going to tell it to you anyway, and if I find the source, I'll add it to the show notes at some point. So it describes how Garbo, as a wee girl, once accompanied her father to the hospital. He died in 1920, so this must have been around the time of the First World War, give or take. And though the Social Democrats didn't bring socialism to Sweden properly until well into the 1920s, already at that point, it was possible to be seen by a doctor for free, or I think a kind of nominal sum. The problem was that those who could pay were prioritised, so someone who couldn't pay would sit there for hours, technically at the front of the queue, as richer people came and went. And this was exactly what happened to young Garbo and her father for several hours, until finally she stood up on a bench and she fainted dramatically into a passing doctor's arms. When he offered to treat her immediately, she pointed him in her dad's direction. She really seems to have been acutely conscious of her family's poverty, and this may well account for her determination to get all the money in her later years. In 1931, Greta described her childhood to Swedish magazine Lektyr. It was eternally grey, those long winter's nights. My father would be sitting in a corner scribbling figures on a newspaper. On the other side of the room, my mother is repairing ragged old clothes, sighing. We children would be talking in very low voices or just sitting silently. We're filled with anxiety as if there's a danger in the air. Such evenings are unforgettable for a sensitive girl. However, she always had her imagination to escape to. There's so many stories of neighbours seeing her playing make-believe all by herself around Blekinegatan, and of her coercing school friends into putting on plays with her. Her Aunt Maria reported finding Greta sitting alone one day and asking her what she was doing. "I'm thinking," she replied, "of being grown up and becoming a great actress." According to Greta Garbo, Divine Star by David Brett, in February 1917, Garbo dragged a friend along to Stockholm's film studio Nordic Studios on the island of Lidingö to the north of the city. Even today, Lidingö is a bit of a pain to get to, as the underground stops at Ripsten, and then you have to change onto a bus to get across the bridge to the island. And so it was for Greta and her friend, but they didn't have enough money to pay the toll to get across the bridge. But it was February in Stockholm, and so the water was frozen solid. Now, I know that stretch of water quite well. I have crossed the bridge by bus plenty of times, and I've been on the water below in a boat and a kayak, and it's pretty wide. If it started to crack in the middle, you would be in trouble. And further, though it's obviously not open sea, it's a channel between two islands, it's part of the same body of water that is the Baltic Sea, and there's gigantic liners going to St. Petersburg, passing by, I don't think even a kilometre away. Like, I'm just saying, I wouldn't walk on that ice. So the fact that Garbo did betrays a healthy determination to make it to the film studios, and this is one of the contradictions that we see time and time again with her. She was clearly incredibly ambitious, and yet she retired at 36. When her father died in 1920, all three siblings had to leave school and go to work, even though Greta was only 14. In the 80s, she told Swedish journalist Sven Broman, "I've always had a complex because I had so little schooling." She first went to work as a lather girl at a barbershop on Götgatan, and then to the hat department, as I mentioned, of the fancy department store, kind of comparable to Selfridges or Saks Fifth Avenue pub over in the city centre. Magdalena Hellberg, who was her supervisor at pub, told a reporter in the 70s, she was conscientious about her duties, but she was always dreaming about movies and the theatre. She told me once, "It's all I ever think about." That Greta made such a great success in later years must be attributed chiefly to the fact that she was always ambitious, never gave up trying, and cautiously, but with determination, climbed every rung of the ladder until she reached her goal. So again, we see that contradiction. In November 1926, she wrote home from Hollywood to an old friend, Lars Saxon. "I've twice turned my back on the studio and gone home. Threats and all, none of it had any effect. I didn't go back until I'd calmed down. I stayed home for over a week. Then I went back and I played it. It was a huge scandal, let me tell you. That's just not the kind of thing they do here." And this was barely a year after Garbo arrived in Hollywood. She went on strike both for more money and also so that she wouldn't have to play the hated vamp character anymore. Another contradiction, one of the most famous vamps of all time hated the vamp. She got the money, and she, Louis Mayer, and Irving Thalberg came to a compromise about the characters that she would play from then on. According to Complicated Woman, out of that push and pull between Garbo and MGM came a new type, the virtuous vamp, the good bad woman, the glorious notorious woman that Garbo would play for the rest of her career. So simply by being as valuable as she was to the studio, Garbo got to fundamentally change the nature of the vamp, a stock character that had dominated movies for over a decade at this point. And crucially, this new Garbo character proved to be more and more of a hit at the box office than the one-dimensional vamps that she'd played before. Say it with me, powerful woman equals better, more successful movies. A Woman of Affairs, released in 1928, was one of the top grossing films of the year, as was her first talkie Anna Christie. And the release of 1931's Mata Hari caused panic, with police reserves required to keep the waiting mob in order. 1932's Grand Hotel was one of the highest grossing films of the entire decade. And Grand Hotel is, of course, the movie in which she utters the oft misquoted line, "I just want to be left alone." According to Garbo, a biography by Barry Paris, for half a century it was believed that Garbo left MGM up in the air, letting the studio fret for 8 months while she lounged abroad. The truth was that before she left, frantic behind-the-scenes negotiations had produced a new agreement that was unprecedented at MGM, or for that matter, in Hollywood history. This top-secret 2-picture deal signed by Garbo on the 8th of July 1932 bound the studio to set up a special production company just for her. She would get $250,000 per film and director and co-star approval too. Now, of course, we know this was far from unprecedented. Mabel Normand had had a deal like that, as had Mary Pickford, but by this point, it had been well over a decade since any actor had got a deal like that. Now, I could talk to you all day long about Queen Christina, the film she made upon her return, and essentially executive produced thanks to this secret production deal. It's one of my favourite films, and I really believe that it's one of the best pre-codes. It tells the story of Queen Christina, who abdicated the throne of Sweden in 1654. Now, in reality, she abdicated to become a Catholic, but in the movie, it's for the love of a lowly Spanish ambassador, who was played by John Gilbert, Garbo's on-again, off-again fiancé. It contains one of my all-time favourite lines of dialogue. So Christina's chancellor is pitching her all these diplomatic marriage proposals. She's basically swiping left on all of them, and he says, "But your majesty, you cannot die an old maid." And she replies, "I have no intention to, Chancellor. I shall die a bachelor." But Garbo had to fight for just about every frame with the censors, and while she did continue to act throughout the 30s, it's always seemed to me that Christina was the turning point that made her fall out of love with Hollywood. For one thing, she hated it. She was mortified that a Hollywood love story had been tacked on to a historical biopic, writing home to a friend, "It's impossible to try and achieve anything out of the ordinary here. This is the last time I'm going to try. If only those who dream about Hollywood knew how difficult it all is." Queen Christina was a critical success, but at the time it was portrayed as a box office disaster. It was decades later that it finally came out that it had in fact grossed third highest of all of Garbo's films. Now, some historians argue that this was to keep John Gilbert from thinking that he had made a successful comeback, while others argue that it was more political. That as the motion production code came down on Hollywood, it didn't do to suggest that a bisexual woman who has unabashed premarital sex, because yes, that is the film, was a box office draw. Now, another wee story from Queen Christina tells us a lot about Hollywood gossip and the disservice they do to powerful women. Now, there's an anecdote that I have come across half a dozen times probably from the shooting of Queen Christina, and every version goes roughly like this. So Garbo, as I've mentioned, had a complex about her lack of theatre experience and used to refer to herself as not a real actress. She believed that her every performance was a fluke. But the director of Queen Christina, Ruben Mamoulian, came from a theatre background. He'd studied at the famous Moscow Arts Theatre under Stanislavski, who, if you've taken any acting class, you'll probably have heard of. So he was big into rehearsal, while Garbo refused to rehearse in case it broke the magic of her performance. So the story goes, they got into an impasse over rehearsal, and Mamoulian suggested that they do the first take of the scene, then they rehearse it, then they take it again, and Garbo could choose which version they printed. Garbo watches the two, then comes running over to Mamoulian all mortified and begs him to burn the first one because he was right and she was wrong. And I've always been a little bit dubious about this. And don't get me wrong, Mamoulian was undoubtedly a great director. But all the same, the idea of this guy who at the time had only been in Hollywood for I think 2 or 3 years, schooling the biggest star in the world on rehearsal, frankly, it's obnoxious. It kind of suggests that if only she had had his guidance all along, she might have been successful. Except again, she was the biggest star in the world. And then I came across this. So this is from Ruben Mamoulian in conversation with Garbo's biographer Sven Broman. My first take is always the best, insisted Garbo. But if it doesn't work, can we agree that we will work according to my methods, i.e. rehearsal, he replied. Don't worry, said Garbo. Garbo was right, admitted Mamoulian. She really could act. She was an intuitive actress. It was something of a miracle, a divine gift. Garbo was simply unique. So according to the director himself, she was right and he was wrong. Why didn't that version make it into Hollywood history? Perhaps despite herself, Garbo made some of her greatest successes in the 30s, including Anna Karenina, Camille, Ninochka. Even her last film, The Two-Faced Woman, was slated by the critics, but it recovered its costs twice over. And even if it had been a flop, a star of Garbo's status could have absorbed it. I can't think of a major star that hasn't had at least one flop. And this is why Hollywood historians have debated for decades just why this ambitious woman retired so suddenly and so completely. In 1986, she told Sven Broman, I was tired of Hollywood. I did not like my work. Two-Faced Woman was hardly any worse than any other, but I had started to abandon my film career long before that. So she then goes on to talk about how the film's morality was protested by the Catholic Church, who successfully managed to get some of it cut. And she says, you really couldn't take a trivial film like that so seriously. And that's always been my theory. For all her mixed views on Hollywood and fame, Greta Garbo really seems to have been very steadfast in her determination to make films she believed in, even if they were, as she says, trivial in entertainment. Though she arrived in Hollywood after the tide had already begun to turn towards like big business, and it wasn't that wild creative free-for-all that it was at the very beginning, she managed to catch the tail end of those glory days. But as the studio system really took hold and the motion production code came down, it eventually became impossible for even a star of Garbo's magnitude to make the kind of movie she wanted to. And I think we all suffer for it. And on that depressing note, thanks for listening. Next episode, just to cheer us all up, we are going to talk about editor Margaret Booth, who completely bucked this trend and was still supervising post-production in the late 70s at the age of 87. I really hope you'll join me then, and in the meantime, the usual shameless reminder that if you're enjoying this podcast, please tell all your friends. Thanks again, and see you next time.